we're going to look at, and it's really, we're going to open with ActionAid. They're going to talk with us about decolonizing development from the context of an international NGO operating in a development context, and then we're going to look at some speakers looking at voices of indigenous voices in development discourse, and we've two speakers in the in that session, Pajwal Kedkar and Astrid Perez Pinan. Astrid is joining us from Canada, and is traveling at the moment, so is her timing may work, may not work. We may need to change the time slightly, but when she logs in, we'll give her space to give her presentation. So the timings may be slightly different, but our intention will be finish at 3:30 and have a discussion and break into I think it's a Catherine 4 discussion groups or 3 discussion groups. Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, it's 3 groups, Paul.
3 groups. That's great. That's great. And we'll have opportunity to discuss and then give some feedback, and Catherine will sum up for the day, and then we'll flag what's happening tomorrow. But I think maybe without further ado, I think it would be good to get started on the afternoon session. What I'd really like to do is hand you over to Karol and Anusanthee from ActionAid. Karol is the CEO and has extensive experience in development and in the management and delivery of development internationally. And Anusanthee is the Global Women's Protection Advisor for ActionAid. And I think you'll go first yourself, Karol, am I right?
No, Anusanthee is going to go first before me.
Anusanthee, that is great, Karol. That's great. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you, Anusanthee, if that's okay. I'm not sure if you have a presentation, but feel free to share it on the screen if you do.
No, I don't. And Anu is fine. You can call me Anu.
That's great, Anu. Thanks.
Not such a mouthful. Sorry that I'm not putting my camera on. I don't have a very strong internet connection, and I'm afraid to get disconnected, or I'll try to switch it on towards the end just so that you can see me. But I'll start off, if that's okay, unless it feels a bit weird.
No problem.
So I'm going to talk a little bit, as you mentioned, I'm the Global Protection Advisor at ActionAid International, and I'm based in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And I'm going to talk a little bit more broadly about decolonial development through an Indigenous and feminist critical lens in the South African context. And I think Karol will pick it up from there and speak more specifically about ActionAid. So I'm picking up a little bit. I listened in a little bit earlier to the other speakers, and I'm picking up a little bit from, I think the speaker was Sharanya, who talked about decolonizing the self. And this is a bit picking up a little bit from there, my personal reflection from my historical context. So as a woman who was born and raised in South Africa and also being of Indian origin, I've witnessed and experienced firsthand the devastating effects of our history as a descendant of Indian indentured laborers and surviving the system of apartheid. So my great-grandfather was brought to South Africa from India as a young man with his wife and 1-year-old son, who became my grandfather. And they came to start a new life in South Africa, but were slaves. And the horrors that they experienced are very well captured in a historical fiction called Children of Sugarcane by Joanne Joseph, which is a really good book to read to get that historical perspective. So it's important to note that the issue of decolonization and decoloniality are not new issues. It's not new, nor has it been adequately addressed. For instance, in South Africa, we are all familiar with the well-documented struggle of our country's resistance and the struggle for freedom from oppression, exploitation, and dehumanization that was based on race, class, and gender, and that spanned centuries. It started with Jan van Riebeck's arrival in the Cape in 1652 to the end of apartheid in 1994. So that's 350 years of colonization and 60 years of apartheid. So although the system of apartheid ended 30 years ago, the shadow of colonization, which we call coloniality, still affects us very deeply. And I'm talking here about the lasting impacts of colonization on our knowledge systems, our culture, and power structures. I think it's really crucial for us to understand this if we are going to address and dismantle these enduring inequalities from an indigenous and feminist perspective. So just to go quickly into some terminology, coloniality and modernity are co-constituted and intersect with patriarchy. So these things were developed together, shaping each other in ways that continue to impact contemporary society. For example, in South Africa, the Group Areas Act of 1950 forcibly relocated all Black South Africans into racially segregated areas, disrupting communities and exacerbating poverty. This had a disproportionate impact on Black women, who often bore the brunt of the burden in maintaining their families and communities amidst the upheaval caused by forced removals. The mining industry, which should have made South Africa a very wealthy country, but which benefited very few, is another example of how the capitalist economic system that accompanied colonization relied on the subjugation of both indigenous people and women to extract labor and resources for the benefit of the European colonial powers and settlers. Also important to understand that coloniality is distinct from colonialism, especially through the focus of the former on the epistemic. Colonialism's focus on the epistemic. Colonialism was what we talk about when we're talking about the direct political domination and territorial conquest. The coloniality is much more insidious. It refers to the lingering impact on knowledge, culture, and power structures long after the official end of colonialism. So how do we detach from European epistemologies the ways of knowing and understanding the world imposed during colonization? How do we reclaim and revitalize the suppressed indigenous knowledge systems? This is something that we're struggling with in South Africa. This must not be just an academic exercise. It's a crucial step towards justice and equity. Indigenous civilizations beyond Europe represent a rich tapestry of human history. In South Africa, for instance, the Khoi and San people had a profound understanding of human and nature relationships, embodying philosophies that emphasize femininity, care, compassion, humility, and inclusion. In African philosophy, Ubuntu is another concept which emphasizes communal unity and mutual care, and this philosophy resonates deeply with these values. So similarly, other global indigenous philosophies underscore that humanity cannot survive without inclusion, compassion, care, and humility. Unfortunately, the European colonial project went a long way to destroying the social, political, cultural, economic, and environmental institutions we had. Over the past 500 years, we have been pressured to unlearn our indigenous epistemologies, often punished until we submitted to European ways of knowing. This has profoundly affected regions, especially like Africa and Asia. So the worst part of the colonial project is not just the plundering of resources and the destruction of institutions, but the colonization of the minds of people. Combined with globalization and modernity, we continue to experience this colonization of the mind, making it challenging to think outside European epistemology. This has impacted our lives, including education, health, and even our relationships with each other. So this is epistemic obedience, the colonization of the mind, continues to erode our own epistemologies from the global south. For instance, in academia, can we conduct research using methods like meditation and consulting ancestors? These do not fit into European epistemology, but are integral to many indigenous knowledge systems. So if we are to think about decolonial development, we first need to detach ourselves from European and North American epistemologies. We need to reconnect with our indigenous ways of understanding the world and bring care, compassion, humility, and inclusion back into our lives and into our institutions. So I'll just briefly talk about some of the challenges of implementing decolonial frameworks before I hand over to Karol, who will tell you what we've been doing in ActionAid. Some of the challenges that we face, one is institutional resistance. Many educational and government institutions are deeply rooted in Western epistemologies, making it difficult to introduce and validate indigenous knowledge systems. My personal experience with this was doing a PhD in the UK. I had to struggle to convince my examiners that my PhD was acceptable because of my attempt at epistemic disobedience. Economic dependencies, the economic structures influenced by global capitalism often prioritize Western frameworks, undermining efforts to develop and sustain indigenous economic practices. So I'm also the co-lead of the Feminist Humanitarian Network, and we often struggle to convince donors of our way of working because it does not conform to accepted Western practice of management and administration. Social perceptions, there's pervasive belief ingrained through centuries of colonization that Western knowledge is superior. This makes it challenging to convince people of the value and validity of indigenous epistemologies. So recently, the Feminist Humanitarian Network took 16 people to New York to the Commission on the Status of Women. And at a healing session that were run by these women all from the global south, the white women walked out of the session because it did not comply with their standards of practice. They accused the women of being harmful and irresponsible to talk about healing without a psychologist present. So these are some of the struggles. The education system from primary to tertiary levels is predominantly based on Western curricula, which marginalizes indigenous knowledge and practices. So recently I visited my grandson and I was quite saddened to see him studying Afrikaans, the language of our former oppressors. And when questioned, he said that it was just too difficult to find Zulu teachers. So he couldn't learn Zulu, so he has to learn, because they have to do a second language, he's studying Afrikaans. So these are some of the ways that we are struggling to escape or to detach from the European epistemologies. So I'll end here by saying that to move towards a more inclusive and equitable society that values and integrates indigenous and feminist perspectives, we must go beyond discussions and framework development. We need to profoundly examine the practical implications and address the challenges of actual implementation, including challenging and changing deeply embedded mindsets. As well, we must also think through what recourse do we have when this process is committed to in principle but not practiced. What remedies have we set up? What do we do when people don't comply with what they have committed to? So I'll stop there with that question and hand over to Karol. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anu. I think certainly I enjoyed a lot listening to your rich insights, and I'm sure many others did as well. So I'm going to take us through kind of ActionAid's process of looking at decolonization, and just to kind of so there's a couple. I'm going to just explain who we are a little bit and the process that we've been going through, and talk a little bit about things we're doing well, and talk about things that we're not doing so well and that are very much a work in progress, and then outline kind of what we're doing in terms of progressing decolonisation. So firstly, for those of you that don't know, ActionAid was established very much as a traditional kind of colonial patriarchal charity model in the 1970s. So there's no question about that. Our origins are very much part of that kind of very traditional model. Established as a British entity with the kind of focus on reaching out to those in need and fundraising very much at its core. And there has been a development, thankfully, over the last few decades with the organisation. And I think a significant moment in the 1990s when the organisation made the deliberate decision to begin to switch from a charity model to a rights-based model. So really embedding the practice of human rights-based approaches as core to our DNA and core to how we work. And that happened and has been growing and still remains very much part of our work. But that was a big focus from the 1990s to the early 2000s. And then there was quite a radical moment, I would say, in the early 2000s where ActionAid kind of decided to take that a step further and really try to shift that model. And, you know, we're very much kind of talking about these issues today, but in the early 2000s, they weren't really part of the core development discourse. And I'm going to read the kind of a piece from our founding constitution as ActionAid International, because I think it's as relevant today as it was in 2003. But basically, we were set up with the founding principle that NGO development projects, while producing positive outcomes at local levels, are certainly not sufficient to eradicate poverty and are often not sustainable. They have not been able to change the overall pattern of massive and increasing poverty and inequality. The solution lies in a global movement led by poor and marginalised people that cuts across national and south-north boundaries. And the founding of ActionAid International is our participation and contribution to such a movement. So I think those words, you know, they were the guiding principle of ActionAid International, and there has been this process of trying to establish 45 independent entities. These days we're actually present in about 71 countries, but the idea is that in our governance model, there's a general assembly where everybody is equally represented. The staff, you know, ActionAid Kenya, they're led by Kenyans, Ethiopia by Ethiopians, so very much as equal. So Ireland and Ethiopia are in theory equal across the federation. So that was really a pivotal moment for ActionAid International and ActionAid as a federation. So in terms of kind of what we're getting right, I'll kind of go through that first. I think there is a recognition that even though that vision was set out 20 years ago, we're not where we want to be, and we are still in some respects largely, you know, we represent and look like a traditional INGO, and I think that speaks to ourselves but also to the sector as well, that there hasn't been a massive upheaval in terms of how the development sector works and INGOs within that. But I do think we have held on to that vision and recognized that we haven't necessarily progressed it the way that we like, but actually there's more discussions now to build on that vision and to really ensure that the political engagement and being rooted and a campaigning force north and south for social justice and women's rights very much remains as part of the overarching vision. The other parts that I think are very strong within the organisation, the focus on human rights-based approaches has very much remained. I wouldn't say we could hand over heart say that absolutely every element of our work is, you know, rights-based down to its core, but it is certainly a core part of the DNA of how we work. Anu mentioned the commitment to feminist approaches. So we have feminist leadership principles that guide us as an organisation in terms of our HR, how we work together, and how we then transpose that and work from a programming perspective with the feminist analysis. And the network that Anu mentioned, the Feminist Humanitarian Network, is a good example of that, where in practice we're trying to be a different type of feminist model. We've also developed across the Federation a lot more support for social movements. So trying to get out of the kind of, the putting everybody into a westernized understanding of development, that you have to be an NGO and you have to be able to do this and that, and really trying to work at a much more rooted level with social movements. And this very much ties to our rights-based work, where the core principle is starting with the communities and starting with those most marginalized at the community level, identifying what their issues are, and really, I suppose, a consciousness raising process around rights and people claiming rights as opposed to seeking charity. We have also made commitments across the Federation to kind of see how do we catch up. We had this big vision in the early 2000s. We're still kind of caught a little bit in that in-between space of not quite being that vision of, a social movement and really supporting those north-south, south-north connections. So ActionAid Ireland, Brazil and Vietnam put down a motion 2 years ago to our General Assembly to say that we welcome the focus on issues like, shifting power and conversations around localization. They're interesting, they kind of get us somewhere, but they're nowhere near the systems change that is required, and a request to the Federation as a whole to pick back up and reinvigorate that process around decolonisation. And I think it was important that that motion was a north-south, because we have a role in the north, and that is really important in terms of that shifting power and assessing our role. And then since then, we have been doing some evaluation across the Federation. So there was a piece of work with a team of consultants from the Global South helping us identify at a regional level what each region sees as the core decolonisation challenge, what are our internal challenges, what is the world telling us. So they interviewed about 94 people, staff, partners, community members, drawing out the experiences and what were the challenges and the asks. And they really varied across the regions. This was before the awfulness that we're seeing now from October in Gaza, but Palestine came out really strongly from the Middle East. We saw different kind of focuses in Africa around how there had been more development of public services, and that's been undermined by bodies like the IMF and various things. And then in the Americas, it was much more around the kind of the legacy of slavery and how Indigenous populations have been treated. So there was quite a variance, as you would expect from the regions when we looked at this. And then they're the kind of, I suppose, the strongest points. And just the last thing to say around what we're getting right is very much around, I think we have a commitment to look at systems change in our work from the local to the national and the international, and recognizing, it's not just about development and humanitarian interventions. We need to see debt dropped. We need to see fair trade rules. We need to see the rules of the game that are so rigged against the Global South, with institutions like the IMF and the World Bank challenged. And even though it might seem like the language of structural adjustment has gone away, the practice has not gone away. So challenging those kind of things, challenging the private finance flows around fossil fuels with the feminist perspective. So very strong commitment to systems change. So that all sounds great, and there is much there, but there is much as well that we are not progressing and not getting right. I think as I mentioned, we are still caught in that INGO model where we act as a funder in many cases. In fact, we have a partnership with Irish Aid. Many of our peers across Europe have similar partnerships. So those funding relationships come with bureaucracy and reinforce that power flow, even, Irish Aid being quite a progressive donor, but there is just a reality that there is a bureaucracy that flows with results frameworks and money and accountability and conditionality that comes with that. And even internally within the Federation, while on paper we have this fantastic model about shifting power and everybody having an equal voice, we would be a fool to think that everybody has an equal voice, when in fact 3 members of the Federation make up about 60% of the global income that we bring in. And of course, that level of resources comes with power and authority within the Federation. So those internal dynamics very much remain. We also have child sponsorship, which is a complex piece for us because it has allowed us to do very rooted work using human rights-based approaches, but obviously the ethical problems of, you know, how that is marketed, and this is something that we're looking at. But, you know, it's interesting talking to colleagues in the Global South who this has given them, in some cases, almost 20 years of funding without those conditionalities of results frameworks, and has allowed that bottom-up working. So it is a contradiction that we hold as we look at this. And I think, as Anu mentioned, we do have that English language dominance and valuing of a particular type of knowledge and a particular type of power that I think is very much embedded within this sector. So we are actively looking at this and looking at the kind of the core areas around governance and management, how we actually make that more to represent the shift in power more, to make it more democratic despite the money that you have. And there have been some positive progress around this with we have a global leadership team, which is trying to kind of shift that balance of the big three holding all the money within a shared global leadership structure. But there's much more that we could do, particularly in terms of how rights holders, communities, social movements influence and shape the governance and management of ActionAid. We are committed to looking at programming, policy and partnerships, so to make sure that we are engaging in ways that really support struggles rather than trying to bureaucratize them and make them look a little bit like ourselves. We have a commitment to grow unrestricted funding, which is very challenging, but that would allow a lot more of the type of, you know, kind of movement building work that we want to prioritize. We want to assess knowledge building and capacity to make sure that we are not prioritizing a particular type of knowledge, a particular language. And we want to look at our communications and campaigns, so making sure that we can really stand over, you know, our aspiration to be anti-racist in our focus, to be fully feminist and to be decolonized. So we have a long way to go, I would say, but, you know, we have the aspiration there and the plan to put it into action, but it is a work in progress. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Karol. And thanks very much, Anu. Both of those inputs were really, really valuable. I think it was really fantastic to make that distinction, decoloniality, in terms of the insidiousness and the colonization of the mind. And Uma, to share your story and the story of your family, your community, and South Africa. I think it's really insightful for us in terms of our own discussions. And Karol, in terms of your own journey in ActionAid, I think it is really important to hear the challenges, hear the achievements, hear the contradictions, hear the whole range of different the different elements of the journey that you're taking. And it's really good to see that people are consciously engaging organizationally in this type of thinking. What I'm going to do is, rather than open it to questions and answers, what we might do is move on to our next speaker, and we'll have an opportunity after that. And I'd like to introduce Dr. Gerard Murphy, or Gerard Maguire, sorry. And Gerard doesn't need any introduction. He's spoken at the DSAI conference a number of times and at the summer schools, and is a long-standing advocate here in Ireland and globally in terms of human rights and human rights-based approaches to development. So Gerard, I'll hand directly over to you if that's okay, and feel free to share any presentation you might have on the screen.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you, Karol and Anu, as well, for fascinating insight. My hand is cramping from all the scribbling of notes I was writing down as we went along. It was great to hear this. And I'm so grateful as well to DSAI for just having this event and this topic in particular, because I'm sure, like many feminist conversations I've had even with Nida over the past couple of weeks, is that this, in Europe especially, the Indigenous discourse seems to have really dropped off the lens or the global stage, or I suppose the European stage at the moment, even in law conferences where there were always specified streams for Indigenous rights or human rights-based approaches to Indigenous issues, they've all disappeared this year, which was really concerning. So it was really kind of I suppose, reaffirming to see this happen this year. So it was really exciting to see this topic and be a part of it. I think I overshot and overestimated how much time I would have. So I will share my slides. And if anybody does want them, feel free to email me. I'll send them on, but I'll fly through them as quickly as I possibly can.
But feel free to take till past. You know, I mean, we started a little bit late, so don't.
Oh, perfect.
Overrush. Yeah.
Brilliant. Hopefully I won't bore you all too much, hopefully. So essentially what I wanted to do is take you through an issue, or I suppose the area of my current research, which has always been human rights law is what my basis is, but I've always been mostly involved with the rights of Indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities, focusing primarily on Indigenous peoples. And that lends itself to a whole host of concerns, considerations, ethical considerations as a researcher. I've often had this, so that's what I want to talk about today, is how to position, or how I've managed to position myself within this kind of discourse of Indigenous rights, but especially in relation to gender. I am a Western white male, often a representation of the oppressors through Indigenous history. So really trying to position myself within this took a long journey, and trying to integrate that into my own research methods was a really long process, and just trying to share some of that through this today, it would be great. So I won't go to that. So just for some of the language and terminology, so not for the actual language, for the wording being used, but more so in terms of syntax and grammar. I just want to highlight that my research always employs the techniques from Monash University guidelines. And that can seem a little bit odd sometimes using an Australian university when Canada is the context of most of my research at the moment. But Monash, their system, just for those in this research and in this area, it offers the most consistency with things like capitalization. The UN is not even consistent with the capitalization of terms like Indigenous and peoples. So that's just, I just wanted to put a little caveat there for that. So with this, I found, so with my PhD research, it was focused on the Canadian residential school system, and it looked at, again, elements of you know, this forced assimilation as an aspect of cultural genocide. And that's where it kind of brought me to seeing all of these kind of flaws within my research. When I started my Viva, I had an Indigenous professor, was an external examiner, and a human rights lawyer as another external examiner. And it was just really interesting to me. The first thing that my Indigenous examiner said to me was, "That's great, you've wrote 100,000 words, you didn't use I once." And I said, you know, well, of course I didn't. I had to write this academic text. We can't use the word I, we don't use personal pronouns. And the response I got was, well, you cannot be involved with Indigenous research or Indigenous scholarship without including this I, this story, this experience. It's really important to, as a community, for us. So that was how I had to kind of shape this. Went back and forth between the Indigenous examiner and the non-Indigenous examiner about how to include this. And this was drafting this kind of more well-rounded statement of positionality within the research. And this kind of bridged it a little bit there. So just talking about that statement of positionality within this context was recognizing, you know, let's call it what it is, the privilege I had in this research, starting with, I suppose, the PhD, and now going on to this bigger project around Indigenous gender justice in Canada. And at that time, you know, we were looking at COVID, it just hit. So I was also having that guilt or that shame, I suppose, of being an armchair researcher. So not only was I a representation of what was historically an oppressor, an oppressive presence, I was also doing this very comfortably, you know, from the West and not being involved on the ground. So that was really, really difficult. So there were different ways around that in which I tried to kind of combat that in many ways. But some of the things that needed to be taken into consideration, you know, personal background, professional background, beliefs, values. And that was kind of difficult to get around because sometimes it can be a little bit uncomfortable. You know, I think it's kind of like any form of reflective practice, you know, identifying things that you may not be completely comfortable with when we're doing it. But the whole idea was behind this was, why was this so essential to this research? Why is it even more essential now that I'm working on Indigenous gender justice? And I mean, for me, it's about being a responsible researcher. It's about being authentic to original information. You know, both previous speakers mentioned the traditional knowledge owners and the information gatherers followers and being authentic to that, you know, this is not my experience. I am relying on the lived experience and quite often traumatic experiences of others. And it's trying to also then try to remove that otherness. It's a very difficult and very kind of complex minefield to navigate sometimes. And I think the biggest kind of benefit I have found of having a really detailed statement of positionality is, you know, this word that we fear, well, many academics fear, of cultural relativism, and how that can really take away or detract from what it is that you're trying to say. So it really does kind of turn that on its head, and it just highlights to not only the communities that you're working with or the peoples that you're representing or the experiences that you're using to shape what it is that I'm writing. It also it explains why, or highlights why I'm doing what I'm doing. It's to advance a voice, to advance the rights, not to take ownership or claim any knowledge or experience over mine. So again, I always look back at this idea of, it's a very basic one when I'm teaching this to students. I always use this little color chart here about this power and privilege dynamic wheel, about how it can shape our positionality, even though we might not necessarily see it. And what's really been interesting recently, I say recently, the last academic years, I've been utilizing this then as well with intersectionality theory from Kimberly Crenshaw, and looking at this and really looking at these intersecting identities that really shape us as not only learners, but as educators and researchers. And it really has changed how I've seen a change even in essays that I'm receiving around how they're being kind of perceived, these comments or this content that we're talking about. So that's just bringing it up to what it was. And here's a very quick sample. I'm not going to read it, just a piece, a paragraph taken from my own statement of positionality for this ongoing research, which will bring us pretty much straight into what it is that I want to talk about. Which is, again, Indigenous gender justice, and looking at essentially, sorry, I'll move this screen here if I can out of the way so you can see that there, sorry. So looking at, you know, so can state and non-state acknowledgement and pursuit of Indigenous gender justice enhance the realisation of the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples in Canada? So again, there's a lot of interconnectedness here, and sorry to bore anyone that's non-law or has no interest in this, but again, yeah, the right to self-determination has kind of been the backbone of looking at these different, I suppose, intersecting injustices of Indigenous life in Canada, looking at historically right up to present day. So that's where that kind of comes from here. So looking at how that can be advanced. Oh, what am I doing here? I might need to drop that down, actually. Sorry, that's easier again. There we go. So looking at the hypothesis, we don't need to look at that, so that's fine. So Indigenous gender justice, so the way that the research that I'm currently working in, it refers to the pursuit of equality and equity. And what I'm finding more and more when I'm engaging with Indigenous stakeholders around this, especially members of the MMIWG, it's looking at equity, looking at equity before the law rather than equality before the law, and that equity leads to empowerment rather than equality, which is a bit of a sweeping statement, but hopefully we might get into this a little bit more if time allows. And Indigenous gender justice recognises the intersectionality of gender, culture, identity, and I think what's really important, especially in relation to Indigenous gender in Canada, is this colonial history in shaping this experience, and we'll see why as we go on. So some of the key aspects that I delve into or have explored within this is the cultural context. So again, with just finance and time constraints at the moment, a lot of this has been done through gatekeepers with Indigenous communities or with NGOs, Indigenous NGOs in Canada themselves, but taking into consideration the colonial legacy that is left there, looking again for community empowerment and advancing self-determination. So just a brief historical context. I mean, there's no question around this. Canada, it just doesn't seem to be one that gets a lot of the spotlight when it comes to this kind of dark past, but there was a very dark past with Canada and its Indigenous populations. What started as a predominantly mutually beneficial, I suppose, relationship coming with trade, and when invaders or colonizers, say, first arrived, this soon led to abuse and subjugation throughout the system. And what really kind of the pillar of abuse was the Canadian residential school system, where the actual motto of that school, for those that aren't familiar, this was state-sponsored, church-run, and the official government motto was "Don't kill the child, but kill the Indian in the child." So this idea of just wiping out this next generation through forced assimilation, and I think as we've seen with the unearthing of more and more mass graves at previous residential school sites in Canada, there were absolutely elements of physical genocide there too. So one of the aspects of gender that I'm really interested in and that I'm looking at the moment within the Canadian context is two-spirit persons. And the reason that I always found this really, really interesting was when you look at some of the historical writings and when you listen to some of the interviews given by two-spirit peoples in Canada, I mean, this is not we're very new to this, even, you know, in contemporary society, that gender is a spectrum and that there's different elements to it. Where in Indigenous Canadian society, this was always a thing. And, you know, when this is going back to when it was referred to itself as Turtle Island, and two-spirit persons were not only accepted and very, very prevalent, they actually had hugely influential and very important roles within society. This was always accepted and this was always part of it. They were regarded with honor, respect, and their gender identity was seen as sacred. This was something very, very special and usually identified very soon after birth, that it was very clear that this was part of it. But the post-colonial position obviously came with, nope, we need to have very strict ideas of what a man is and what a woman is. So again, huge marginalization and suppression of these two-spirit identities and the roles. This also impacted a huge amount of Indigenous groups in Canada because they were also, many of them, not all of them, especially most Inuit weren't, but other Indigenous groups in Canada were very much so matrilineal societies. But this changed again with this European ideology of what gender and what family should look like. So this really disrupted this. And one of the big issues that I have found from interviews in relation to this has been, there's been a huge loss of knowledge with this, because what used to happen was two-spirit elders would pass on this sacred information, this spiritual information, the history, the stories of the peoples, of two-spirit peoples. They held very important roles. So even things like matchmakers, being matchmakers within these societies, but this was all lost because it was not allowed to be shared, because this was completely restricted and not being used. There is a massive revitalization, and I don't want to even say revitalization, I think it's reclamation is the word to use within Indigenous groups in Canada around these this two-spirit persona. And this has been integrated now into, I suppose, more Western ideas of celebration of pride, of LGBTQIA plus pride. But they are reclaiming and revitalizing this traditional understanding of gender and sexuality. And I mean, I'm on the screen there, if you can see, that's Dr. James Macoka, who is a physician in Canada. And a fantastic one as well. He uses he, him pronouns, but is a two-spirit person, also married to a two-spirit person. And this is something that I think is really interesting, because this is something sometimes, you know, even in Europe, we cannot get right. He spends his time working as a physician, family physician, but then after his normal shift every day goes from literally within maybe a 200-kilometer radius going and providing two-spirit specific healthcare to two-spirit children and teens. So appropriate healthcare for appropriate persons. So again, looking and really shaping this intersectionality that these children or teens or young adults, as they're finding their place as two-spirit peoples within this gender spectrum alone, really helping that with conversations. There's fantastic videos online, and he's very active on Twitter as well. So really helping reshape and research this idea of what gender is within Indigenous communities, and highlighting the pride with that too, that it does belong with it. It leads me to, again, the kind of sadder, more scathing issue, which very much is an endemic in Canada at the moment. And it's not exclusively Canada. There are issues of this in the United States as well. But Canada, it is very problematic, which is the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls crisis, which is absolutely, I mean, it has got to endemic levels at this stage. And this is twofold, and I should be very clear with this when I say that the research at the moment is very much looking at Indigenous communities versus external forces. So, you know, looking at structural institutions and this kind of historic distrust that still exists with many Indigenous communities and external forces like the police force. But there are, I don't want to negate that there are issues within Indigenous communities as well with this, but it's just with time constraints and obviously just the point of research at the moment just haven't got to it just as of yet. Another thing that I always think is really important to note as well, within Indigenous communities, when they do celebrate Pride or when they use the acronym for LGBTQIA, you'll see there, and there's a copy of it on the screen there, 2S, so two-spirit always comes first. So again, that's recognizing the historic role, how ancient this is and has always been within these societies. So between 2009 and 2021, 490 Indigenous women and girls were known victims of homicide. This translated into a rate of 4.2 Indigenous women killed per 100,000. This is 6 times higher than non-Indigenous counterparts. This is a terrifying statistic. When we look at this, there's a terrifying reality that's happening here. And I mean, there are multiple forces with this, because not only are external forces not investigating, they're 50% less likely are the Canadian police to investigate Indigenous women who have gone missing. The highway of tears is there, and where people are just terrified to even walk, because they know if a woman, Indigenous, walks there, they will be lost, they will be taken. There's a lot going on with this. And again, the MMIWG, who I've got a slide at the end to show you how you can connect with them and look at the work that they're doing to really focus on this. So again, it's looking at an intersecting identity, because not only within the state of Canada are Indigenous peoples marginalized, Indigenous women have an intersecting identity that further vulnerabilizes them, it further marginalizes them. There's a Chilean proverb there that I just always kind of like, that I think really is at the heart of this issue, which is a nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it's done, no matter how brave its warriors nor how strong their weapons. And this is something that, you know, I want to say colonial history has happened. So we see that the position of women within Indigenous society in Canada, in the USA, in Turtle Island, in all of Turtle Island, was hugely prolific. And this changed. There is a piece online, there might have a quote of it in a slide coming up, where, you know, it's there, an Indigenous woman from the Nehiwak tribe describes herself as, to the colonizers, I was this gazelle, this exotic gazelle that could be hunted. So again, it shows this ideology that was taken that still exists today. It's still bled through when we look at this. I don't know if any of you happen to see any of the kind of things going around Twitter or even online around May 5th, which is the National Day of Remembrance for the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls in Canada. But I mean, it's really getting scary. And the reason that this is so important to draw this now is Canada has really lagged with this. Not only do they lag generally quite a lot in relation to the problems with its Indigenous populations, at the moment, they're quite, I suppose, proud of their advancements when it comes to their UN Sustainable Development Goals. However, when you look at Canada's report on the UN SDGs and you look at Sustainable Development Goal number 5 and look at gender equality, this goes on for pages about what they're doing to do this, to enhance the rights of women, the role of women, the representation of women, looking at all of these different elements. And then you have a very short, maybe paragraph and a half about this crisis that is the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls problem. It very much seems like an afterthought, but there's no actual action plan that's state sponsored in relation to this. And the reason that I want to highlight it now is, you know, we've 6 years left before, well, very, very enthusiastically and optimistically 6 years left for the accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. But it puts Canada on a global stage to meet these. So it's about drawing attention to this issue that has been so much swept under the rug in relation to this. Because while it looks great on paper, and I think, Karol, you mentioned, you know, as well, something about, you know, when things look great on paper, but practice is very difficult. So even the fact that it's mentioned in the action plan for gender equality for Canada, looking at the endemic of murdered and missing Indigenous girls, women and girls, there is no actual action plan to what's going to do. It's about it. All they do is recognize the problem. So this is really, really problematic. So again, looking at this through an intersectionality approach and a transdisciplinary approach, and I think this is really important for the research methods element of the summer school this year, because I have found when researching Indigenous rights, coming from a law perspective has really limited how I've been able to approach things. And it's only when I started going beyond my legal kind of lens or views and looking at other schools of thought, looking at sociology, looking at development studies, I started connecting the dots and started seeing ways that it could be approached and looking at this. And I think a really simple example always comes to mind when I talk about cultural genocide. And, you know, in international law, that doesn't exist. It's not real. It's not a prosecutionable crime. But if we were to look at elements of development studies and sociological studies, there is very much a definition there for what a cultural genocide can be and how it is supported by the states at hand. So again, the basic concept here of intersectionality is various forms of social categorizations do not operate independently, but instead intersect. So in relation to the women or the position of women and girls, Indigenous women and girls in Canada, is looking at structural oppressions that are still there, but wanting to enhance the visibility of these marginalized voices. And the MMIWG movement itself has done some really great work in relation to this, but I cannot state this hard enough, is this has been Indigenous led. This has not been through governmental support, state support, even international support. This has been a grassroots level, this organization that is made up of victims who were victims of sex crimes or violent crimes, Indigenous women and girls from Canada, family members of the murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls that are now demanding rights. And I think a lot of it is because Indigenous groups we've seen this kind of change, that they've gone from what were perceived as vulnerable groups within society to very much self-actualizing groups of society, and self-mobilizing groups within society, demanding the rights that are owed. And I think this has there's a bit of a long and short history to it, but again, it's this transition of Indigenous peoples where traditionally within international law, they were very much objects, something just to be dealt with, a bit of an issue. You know, if you look at some of the original laws around it, it was in the states where Native populations exist, where the problem of Native populations exist. We're now very much so subjects of international law and instilling these rights. So again, this is just looking at some of the international frameworks that can be used to enhance this. But how it might work in enhancing this right to self-determination is that it respects Indigenous knowledge systems. So again, looking at the acknowledgement of two-spirit persons, recognizing the role that they played. I should say the statistics of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls often does include the statistics for murdered and missing Indigenous two-spirit persons as well. There is a correlation there as well when we see trans women of color, for example, in Canada or in the USA, especially going from the 80s into the 90s, and this high rate of violent crimes, this unreporting because of this distrust with the structural systems that were built to, you know, keep these groups marginalized and subjugated in many ways. I'm just kind of looking at time here, so I will wrap up there. So again, the idea behind this now is working with Indigenous groups at the moment. I've been very lucky that I've gotten to work very closely with many Indigenous groups over the course of my research career, looking at the Sami people, looking at Amerindians in French Guiana, and the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, and the Nahiwak in Canada. So again, it's just at this point of it, this is all being very much done at a distance. So the next step for this, again, is in making sure that voice is included, including the voice of these peoples, especially of these women and girls. The MMIWG have been phenomenal in their support. So the next part will be actually getting there and getting over to Canada to actually get involved with this and see how we can be partners in advancing this rather than, you know, this traditional, oh, let me help you and tell you what's wrong. That's not what's happening here. It's including these voices of gender in it. So this is just the websites I just want to highlight here. So there is a national inquiry at the moment into the MMIWG, but again, this was done by Indigenous peoples. In Canada, especially around these regions where the Nahiwak are, it's not unusual to see these hanging red dresses just hanging from trees. And again, the idea behind this is symbolism. It's to highlight this. The dresses were chosen very purposely to represent, and although this may be, you know, a stereotype, but chosen very purposely to represent the women and girls. One of the things that really helped me with this, and again, this was kind of post-COVID when travel was still restricted, and it was just one that anyone that has an interest in this, I just want to highlight this. The University of Alberta offers an online course in Indigenous Canadian Studies. It is completely free. And it's taught by Indigenous lecturers and Indigenous professors, and they go from everything from, you know, the traditional, the very original fur trade and how that transpired into slavery acts, the abuse of treaty rights, going right up to the residential schools, artists, everything that you can imagine is included in this. And it's such a fantastic resource, and I'm still baffled that it is free to do for anybody. So I always send it to students. It's something you can do in your own time, and the link is there for it. But it is a phenomenal insight, and I think when I first tried to engage with Indigenous gatekeepers to be part of this research and to try and show my support and be involved with this research in relation to Indigenous gender justice, this did speak to a lot, because it meant that I had engaged with this. It showed that I had engaged with some leaders who actually of the Nahiwak that speak in that course as well, that I was able to talk to and meet them. So again, it shapes that positionality, which is sometimes something I think we quite fear in academia when doing something that's very removed from what we're used to or what we know about. So I've just popped my emails there, so do feel free to email me. I know I flew through that, but again, I really overestimated how much time I needed to try and get through it. So I'll stop sharing and just finish up there. But again, and I'll be in person tomorrow, so if anybody wants a copy of the slides, I can send them on then.
Gerard, that is fantastic. That is great. And I mean, I know it's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the range and depth of material that you have and the work that you've done over the years. And it is really encouraging. It is really encouraging when you see well-established academics refer back to their own core research, especially for early careers researchers. It's such a formative experience, and I think the range and breadth of the material really reflects that. If it's okay, I'm really conscious Astrid has joined us, and I'm really conscious it's been enormously it's a privilege to have you here, Astrid, and you're familiar with Dublin, and you studied in Trinity, but I think it's fantastic that you've made your 7 hours, I think, out of kilter with us, or maybe even 8 hours. So I know it's early in the morning for you, and I know it means a slight change in the scheduling, but I think it would be fantastic if Astrid, if you could begin with your presentation, and Prajwal, we might take you directly after that, if that's okay. I'm conscious as well that your